So the saga continues with this little guy, but to take it apart, basically I just zip the cylinder screws out, with this DeWalt and that T27 bit driver, right? A long one. Works pretty good, I suppose. Then basically detach the fuel line, the throttle cable, and I had to unhook where that line goes through. There's kind of like this little deal right there. You have to pull the ignition wires off of that. And here's the cylinder that came out. Pretty much leaving it together. And this morning I was going to see if I can get in there and clean that up a little bit. Realized that I found the electrode. I'll see if I can set a picture in there. I'm having a hard time getting the light to show. Oh, there. It was beat up pretty bad, and I was in there starting to clean up that squish band a little bit and found this little spear. There's still a little mark there. It was stuck in there endwise, pounded in by the piston. You can see on the piston where it pounded in too. And that was making the rattle because it was hitting on that when I ran the saw. That's why I made that noise. So I've got an OEM piston. I think what we're going to do with this one is, because I don't know how much stuff has been circulating down the bottom end, is basically put it together and see if it runs. I was going to mod it, but at this point I think just trying to get some useful time out of it's the right approach. So these rings match this cylinder. I'm going to clean up the squish band a little bit with some sandpaper. I'm going to cut an arbor and push it down in there and clean it up. Put an OEM piston in there. See if it fires up. If it does, just see if it runs for a little bit. And if it proves, in a couple of weeks that basically it's solid, then I'm going to take it back and add some compression and things like that. But I think right now, I don't think it's worth putting the time into it until we know that there hasn't been more damage down below. And short of actually taking the motor apart, the best way of doing that is just to put it back together and run it, get some trees cut and some money made. So yet again, I don't have my camera. So what I'll do is once I get that piston off of there, actually I'll put the camera in the vise and hammer that piston out of there. See, I'm going to use that ring because that didn't have a lot of blow-by, other than having the crap beat out of it. There's nothing wrong with that saw. Let me try this again with a camera device. I spent a bunch of time with the air gun cleaning things up and got a little oil in the cylinder and stuff like that. So let me start by, and I use a little crocus cloth on the end of a stick to clean up the combustion chamber a little bit. But those pits are pretty deep. I'd have to cut probably 15, 20 thousandths out of there. So I think we're just going to run it the way it is. And like I said, the mission is, if it survives, the bottom end survives, well then, we'll put money into it. But until it proves that the bottom end isn't going to frag in a couple of minutes after we stick it together, I don't want to put money into the saw, and I don't want to split the cases, because if I split the cases, I might as well put money into the saw. But there's a chance that bottom end's just solid, so let it go earn some money, and then we'll decide based on what happens. We'll decide what the path for the saw is after that. So anyway, so I usually keep all that stuff pretty much together, and then putting the cylinder back on is not like a huge task. It's a little bit of an aggravation because space is pretty tight in these things, and a ring compressor is pretty much required. A little bit of oil on the inside of the ring compressor. I got this old Homelite oil that I'll use for now. It reminds me of the wolf's head oil story, right? And make sure that's clean. Gotta hold this piston ring if I can. I always just rock it back and forth just a little bit to see make sure that the tail of it's in the, has captured that pin. And it's basically put it on, well, it's basically put it on. The Husqvarna gasket stock is really cool because it sort of bites. There's a couple little tabs, and it kind of bites the bottom of the cylinder. Makes it a lot easier to work with. Again, I got to get this stuff out of the way for now. And I'm using a stock gasket, obviously. And should be about it. Let's see if we got on there. Well, there it is. Start by getting the cylinder a little bit out of the way, bring it down to right about there. And I've got room to work the carburetor. First thing I'm going to do, once I get the cylinder down a little bit, is there's a wire. I'm going to stick it in that wire clamp because it's kind of hard to get to it. So it's down in on that side, right? The second thing I'm going to do is get the throttle cable in its little holder right there. So the wire is in, throttle cable's in. So I got the cylinder partially down. I've got that wire in the loom. I got the throttle cable where it should be roughly. And you see that little spring right here? Right there, it's got to be under this choke lever. So that's the next thing, is to get these parts together to where that can happen. So let me just set the carburetor in. And while this is up, let me get the throttle cable on. Rotate that down into the holes. I'll put the fuel line on after. And back to this side. So I've got the throttle cable on, the carburetor roughly positioned properly, and I've got the choke lever above where it's supposed to be. And make sure that everything else is lined up the way it's supposed to be. Get this thing out of the way. You'll put the spark plug in its little holder. It's a lot easier, at least for me, to get this stuff kind of lined up while the cylinder is just a little bit off the motor. This guy right here is the only big pain in the neck. That breather line. There we go. Now, where's the fuel line? Down here somewhere. Ah, there it is. Make sure that doesn't get in the way. And get the fuel line roughly on. You got that. So throttle line, fuel line. Choke is where it's supposed to be. Cylinder is settling down. Carburetor looks like it slid into its spot properly. Now I'll set the cylinder down. Let me get this guy. I want my pick. My pick makes it so much easier. Screwdriver will work, I suppose, but my pick makes it a lot easier. So those are the anti-vibes. Choke is still good. This stuff is all good. Wire is still where it's supposed to be. Carburetor looks like it's seated where it's supposed to be. Throttle cable is doing its thing. Fuel line's doing its thing. Now I can set it all down. And now I can start getting the screws in. I'm curious, after that relatively easy and fast repair, do we have a running saw? Just we need to get gas on this thing. Gas. Okay, this is that saw that had the piston in the cylinder beat up pretty good. And what I really did was I just put a used OEM piston there just to see if we can get it to run. It's a 2018 model. It's got a fair amount of time on it. And I did try to clean up the squish band a little bit, but I decided not to go through my standard modification process. I didn't want to put the money into the bottom end and stuff until I know that it actually is going to survive. So what we're going to do is let the fella run it for, I don't know, a couple of weeks, a couple of jobs. And if that bottom end holds together and we don't get any air leaks or anything like that, we're going to bring it back and put a pop-up piston and do the mild porting that I do on those and do a muffler mod on it, give it a little bit more snap. But as it is, you know, it seems like it runs. But the interesting thing is the spark plug dropped the electrode down there, beat itself around inside that motor, and eventually got jammed into the combustion chamber. I found it this morning. I had to pull it out with a pair of pliers after I tapped on it with a punch. It left a mark. So the electrode came out. I finally found it, right? So anyway, I'm going to run it, and I'm just going to make a few cuts. I've got a little bit of gas in it, not a lot. Just put it through a heat cycle, and if there's any stuff going on in the bottom end, it'll probably show up pretty quick. See, here's the thing. There's sort of a dynamic mentality to test saws and a static one. It'll pass the vac test, you know, right now. But if the bearing cages got eat up a little bit by that slurry, well, it may fail rapidly after that. So, you know, a guy does a vac test and looks at common service tool, and you get that slice in time where things are actually good enough. But things like the nylon cage bearings have been compromised and something else might be compromised that I don't know about. You're not going to see that in a vac test, and you're not going to see that in common service tool. So by running it a little bit of time, now there's that dynamic test where you've put some time on it. You know, the parts have run, gone through a couple of heat cycles, and if they still hold together, that actually gives me the confidence to go and invest in doing a, you know, more of a hop up. But the definition of fail for me is to do like a vac test, it passes. Look at common service tool. You know it's set rich because it had a loose spark plug, so it was drawing in air. So common service tool is going to see that the auto tune had tuned around that lean condition, right? So right now when I fire it up, it's going to be rich on top for sure. So I'm going to have to do a field reset and then run it for a little bit. And if anything else has been compromised within a couple of tanks, we're going to know. That's the point. Whereas if I just do the standard common service tool and vac test, I'm not going to know whether or not those parts are, you know, at a point where they want to fail prematurely. And if I put $400 of time and materials into it, then it blows up. Then that's stupid. You know, that's a self-inflicted wound. So I don't do it. And that's why I'm taking the approach of just putting the standard piston in there, standard parts, and letting it run a little bit to prove that the internals are still solid. And then once it does that, that's when I'll go back and invest in cutting up a piston, you know, trimming the base and all that kind of thing. But I just don't see the sense in putting that time into the saw and the modifications, you know, the time and labor to modify a saw that might have something else compromised. So anyway, let's just test it. And I don't have my camera, so we're gonna have to use this stump for a stand. And let me see if it will work just like that. And maybe I better drag it back some. Ah. Back again. So what I'll do is pretty much standard affair. Is let's get this off started. Then I'm going to do warm up, and then I'm going to do a field tune, and then I'm going to let it idle for a little bit to set the low side, and then we'll do some cut. I'm going to let it idle for 3 minutes. Well, something's still wrong with it. That ain't right. Let me check the choke. Make sure it's working. So that didn't go well, right? That thing would bog and pop and eventually stalled. What in heck's name do you think is going on? I got no idea. You know, the ignition failed. You know, is there fuel starvation? Still has a little bit of gas. It's not a lot, but it's got a little bit. And but here, let me show you something. I'm gonna fire it up again, and let's see what it sounds like. And then I'll take the cover off, and we'll see if we can figure out what's going on. This is actually presented an opportunity. And I guess if you do this kind of stuff often enough, you run into stuff like this from time to time. So anyway, I'm going to set the camera and fire that saw up, and And let's see what it sounds like now. All right, what happened? Check this out. This is a teaching moment. That's with the air filter on, right? No air filter. They're always a good running saw. I like those saws. Yeah, they always clatter a little bit. I think every one I've ever run just does. That one with a cylinder going through the trauma it had might clatter a little bit more, but I think it's fine. Let's just see if it lasts a couple of weeks before we go back in there and start modifying the thing. So I'll make a few more cuts. Maybe I'll do a noodle. I don't want to run it too long without the air filter because eventually it'll start sucking in dust. But I can't believe the difference that air filter made. You know, I'm not going to go back through it because all it does is mess up auto-tune, trying to tune around that air block. So. guess I'll stick together a little video about how air filters can kill us off. So I just popped the cover, so no chips got in there, you know. They do a pretty good job, and everything seems to be all right. I wonder if this is what started the chain of events, this filter, because oftentimes when a saw gets running terrible, right, first thing you do is you pull a plug. And with the auto tunes in particular, they foul out. So that's one of the auto tune survival techniques, is pull the plug and clean it off and put it back in if somebody couldn't get it fired. But let's say this guy right here was making it get plugged up, right? Just the filter. And then plug came out, didn't get torqued properly, you know, because people are in a hurry. Rattled around a little bit, started sucking some air. Auto tune still could run because it had air. And, you know, eventually the tip broke off, and added insult to injury, bounced around there for a while. Figure, you know, 10, 12,000 times a minute, that thing's bouncing up and down inside that cylinder. It probably ran for a day. Eventually it wrapped that little electrode, stuck it right in the combustion chamber because I had to hammer it out. It was sitting in there. Oh man, this poor saw. So, but you know, it's funny because the reason why I started this whole video was to show that a person can work on an auto tune without common service tool and solve some pretty significant issues. Little did I know we had multiple issues. And common service tool may have helped me figure out that the air filter was plugged, right? But I didn't really need common service tool to recognize that the spark plug was finger tight. That was my first inspection find, because I usually pull it apart to try to check compression. Damn thing, I could turn it out with my fingers. So no wonder it didn't start. I was afraid it beat the threads up, but it didn't seem to do that at all. You know, that plug went in there pretty tight. And then the cascading chain of events ended up with a plug with a electrode coming off and it coming back to me where it won't start. But we put it back together with a stock piston, stock gasket, nothing changed, no modifications. And most importantly, and the most important point, was we solved the mechanical issue without having to go to common service tool and flashing the auto tune. And the second point is, as I was saying in the last video, it's just a darn saw. It's a two-stroke. So mechanical things are more likely what's going to cause problems than auto tune itself. It's going to be something like what we just saw here, air filter or a fuel line, or it just wears out, has low compression. And you don't have to flash the carburetor every time you tear a saw apart and fix things. It's just like putting an electronic ignition on a saw. You don't have to change its timing map just because you took it off and put it back on. Not that you could, it's firmware. But this is the same. It's the same kind of a concept. You pull it off, put it back on. The only difference is this stuff here can actually tune itself again, so I don't have to mess around with a screwdriver. And that saves me hassle and time, the fact that I can do a field tune with this thing. So I went down to Tractor Supply and spent $28 on a tune-up kit, you know. This thing right here. And it came with a spark plug, so I put that in. It came with a new filter, so I put that in. It also came with a fuel filter, so I put that one in too. So there's that plug that came out. And the piston that came out. Filter that came out, which surprised me in that it shut the saw off about as fast as anything. There's the gasket that came out of there. Put a new gasket in. I also put a new sprocket on, so, you know, little details. Let me see whether or not it runs as good now as it did without the air filter, and I'll just do a little bit of cutting with it, and I'll call this a video. And point being, didn't need common service tool, didn't need a dealer, didn't need to flash anything. Alright. It's as good as it's gonna be. So we can start splitting some of this stuff here.